Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight I wanted to start a new book club experiment. My last book club I looked at Hirohiko Araki's Manga in Theory and Practice, and that was a how-to. And this time I want to look a little bit at a manga that actually influenced a lot about how I think about writing and drawing comics. And that's Naoki Urasawa's Monster, which you see right here. This is a fairly old series. In fact, it's almost 20 years old, and isn't that scary to think about? This started publication in 1994, and it's a fascinating story about making moral decisions amongst corrupt systems and people, and also about taking responsibility for the decisions you made that had bad consequences, whether you expected those consequences or not. Now, it's very important to note that the core question of Monster is a well-established one in Japanese literature, and it revolves around what happens when you save a life. You see, in Japan, when you save a life, you are then responsible for the life you saved, almost as if you became a parent. You have to mentor the person whose life you saved. You have to meet their needs after you save their life. You have to help them get back on their feet. If they need help getting on their feet, you need to make sure they have everything they need to make moral decisions in the society, because you are assuming responsibility. You have taken whether they live or die out of the hands of fate or whoever decided that they should die, and you've taken it upon yourself. It's a very heavy thing to do. But it's a thing that our protagonist does quite often, because Kenzo Tenma is a doctor. Specifically, he's a neurosurgeon. Almost every operation he takes on has some kind of long-term impact on his patient's life. And usually he intervenes in life-saving operations, at least in the ones we see in this story. It's a very heavy thing to do. And as we go through this story, we see more and more the moral quandaries of not just being a doctor, but being a doctor who works in larger systems of society, of politics, of economics, and so forth. And Kenzo has to struggle with his decisions, but ultimately he struggles with one decision, the decision he made to save a life and the consequences of the life he saved. And it's fascinating to read, and it's very gripping too. Urosawa was a master of suspense, and we'll look at some of the ways he builds suspense in this story as well. So just a couple of other scene-setting things. This story starts in 1986. As a matter of fact, you can see that right here on this page. 1986, Dusseldorf, Germany. This is before the Berlin Wall fell. We are in Western Germany. Kenzo works in the Eisler Memorial Hospital here. And so another interesting aspect here, we have a Japanese man in a society he's unfamiliar with, and he's attempting to apply ethics which don't always meet up with the cultural expectations he's in at the time. So that's an interesting element in at least the early part of the story. Unfortunately, Urosawa does not really dig into a lot of the cultural differences, and in particular the systemic differences. In fact, he writes Eisler Memorial Hospital very much like it was a Japanese hospital of the time period, which is neither here nor there, but suffice it to say, not too much of... there's fascinating aspects there, but they don't come into play too much, so I'm going to try not to read too much into some of the decisions here. But there is a cultural difference, which is occasionally explicitly noted. So beyond that, let's get to the story itself. We begin by seeing Dr. Tenma coming out of a successful operation. He's just saved the life of the famous opera singer in Dusseldorf, and he goes home and he sleeps it off, and he's awoken by his fiancée, who's the daughter of the hospital director. And actually, before that, we should note one other thing. As Tenma is walking out from the operation, he passes a woman crying on a bench. And this is one of the things that Urosawa does that is good at building tension and suspense, because we've just seen Tenma a little euphoric after a long operation. He saved a life. And he sees this woman crying because her husband has just died on the operating table. Now, in and of itself, that's not super surprising. There is a juxtaposition of lives saved and lives lost in medical institutions. That's just the way it goes. You can't win them all. Tenma doesn't have the time to operate on everyone. Another doctor had to take this case, and he just wasn't as skilled. Because we find out later, Tenma's very confident he could have performed this operation better than the doctor who actually got it. But we don't know that yet. What's important is that we have this contrast. It makes us a little unsettled. But we get back to seeing Tenma on top of the world, because he's got a pretty fiance. He's in favor with the director of the hospital. And on the news, they're telling us that defectors from Eastern Germany have made it across the border, and they're now being protected by the government of Dusseldorf. And that's a really positive thing. Getting out from under communism, always A+ decision there. And then the news moves on to talking about this opera singer whose life was saved in the operating theater by Tenma the night before. And the director's there, he gives an interview, but he never mentions anyone by name. He doesn't mention Tenma. He doesn't. The only person he really mentions by name is the opera singer himself. It's a bit odd, especially considering the time period. There was a lot of rivalry between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. At this time period, they like to build up progress in sports, in industry, in science, and medicine. You would think there would be maybe a little gloating here, but there isn't any. And again, that's one of those things that unsettles one a bit as you read. But we quickly move past that, and the director's daughter, talks Tenma up and takes him out for dinner, and from there we move into just some mundane exposition until a little bit later on, this woman from the first few pages comes back. She confronts Dr. Tenma now that he's rested and back at work, and she demands her husband back. We find out that her husband arrived at the hospital for surgery before the opera singer did. But the hospital made him wait because the opera singer was a more important client. He wanted good press, he has cultural importance. And as the director later tells Tenma, well, some people are just more important than others. And this is our first indication that there are deep flaws and nepotism that run through this hospital like cracks. And they are making Tenma doubt who he is and the morality of his decisions. And Tenma is going to have to confront those cracks in the foundation of the Eisler Memorial Hospital if he wants to continue doing his job, if he wants to marry Ava, the director's daughter, if he wants to one day inherit the director's position, which has been offered to him. And these are very deep, troubling moral questions that Tenma has to confront. And they are going to lead him to make the worst decision of his life. And it's very important that we follow him on the way there. But ultimately, this is not the story of a corrupt medical system. It's not the story of difficult moral decisions. It's the story of what happens after those decisions are made. This is not really Dr. Tenma's story. This is the story of a monster. And soon enough, Dr. Tenma is going to have to come face to face with what that monster is capable of. But more about that in Chapter 2. I hope you'll join me for that. And until then, I hope you enjoyed what we talked about today. If you did, there's a like button, a subscribe button down below. You can use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.